together. Plus, we do the stuff with the royal family. I remember imagine the fly on the wall at Clarence House in the day, in the lead up to it. But you couldn't write it. It's just, it's almost like a train crash. I can't help but look through my fingers at it. I want to look away, but I just can't.
It's a bit sad for the couple. Prince Harry, from all accounts, is a lovely guy who has done great stuff for wounded veterans, and Meghan Markle seems to be lovely, and they met and they fell in love and they want to spend their life together, and it's a shame that they have to go through this horrible publicity pageant because of who he is.
Peter Fitzsimons, the author and Sydney Morning Herald columnist, joins us, the former international rugby player, of course. Good afternoon, Peter.
Good afternoon.
You, sir, are an ardent Republican, I think.
I certainly am. Who isn't? Seriously. Well, I leave New Zealand out of it, but in Australia, I mean, the premise is that in the 21st century, Australia as a sovereign nation can do better than to find our head of state from a family of English aristocrats living in a palace in London. We're an independent people. We need to have a feeling of government that reflects that sense of independence. And at the moment, I think the third child, Prince Louis, of Prince William, I think at the moment he is the fifth most qualified person to be the Australian head of state, and he's 2 weeks old. I mean, please.
There is what, Peter, in your column today, there is what you might call the royal wedding paradox effect, though, for people who are Republicans.
Yes, indeed. Look, as chair of the Republic movement, I monitor it very closely, and there are a lot of people that are into it. My wife, I put her on a plane yesterday. She'll anchor the Channel 10 coverage when it happens on Saturday. She enjoys it, but the theme of my piece today is, they're a nice couple. Good luck to them. And Prince Harry's an admirable young man. She seems to be a very fine young woman. They're going to live happily ever after, we hope, and a lot of people love that stuff. And the point I make in my column is that the two are not mutually exclusive. You can devour all that stuff and still think your own nation deserves to be independent. I mean, in this country, I might say, your Radio New Zealand, I'm sure you're meant to be ruthlessly neutral, but I don't have to be. I really admire your Prime Minister before she became Prime Minister, saying she's a Republican. She breaks the mould and says we can be better than this.
The paradox I was talking about is that even with the fervour around the wedding, there is a corresponding fervour against it which benefits your cause, isn't there?
Yes. I mean, wherever I go, people are saying, how can I sign up? Well, give money, what can I do? I'm getting people on Twitter. Basically, anything that promotes focus on the institution of the monarchy is good for us, because it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. What the idea that this is a special family? Come on. I mean, the quote in my column, I don't know if you've got it there before you could read it out, but the quote from Jerry Seinfeld was fabulous. He was in England for the last royal wedding, which I think was 2011, and they said, you must be excited to be here for the royal wedding, are you? And he said, no. He said, come on, this is dress-ups. This is what the British do, English do very, very well. They have a wonderful sense of theatre. It's why their theatre is so spectacular. They do dress-ups better than anybody. Let's put these people in crowns and gowns and pretend they're special people. And they're not. They're fine people, they're good people, but they're not actually appointed there by God.
Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Yes, that Jerry Seinfeld quote is worth a read. Peter Fitzsimons, David Farrer, Ali Jones have been on the panel today. Thank you both.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
And we're back tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. And Checkpoint is coming.
Tō te marae, hoa mai, he kōrero, kei te haere, he kaupapa, kei te karawhiua. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Tonight on Checkpoint, controversial Gloriavale leader, hopeful Christian, has died at the age of 92. Also tonight, EQC announces it's found another 949 outstanding claims neither it nor the minister nor anyone, as far as we're aware, knew about. A long-running class action proceeding brought by a group of Southern Response customers has finally been settled. We have all the details on that. We are in Jerusalem, of course. Hannahs and Briscoes admit there have been cases when staff on minimum wages have been expected to attend unpaid meetings or cash up for free. And the march for tikanga to Parliament this morning. Busy Checkpoint. Stay with us.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batten, aho. The Earthquake Commission has discovered it has almost 1,000 more unresolved earthquake claims in Christchurch than it thought. This brings the total number of open claims to 3,500, 7 years after the earthquakes. The Commission says it discovered the oversight when it upgraded its systems and began attaching case managers to those with claims. The Chief Executive, Sid Miller, says this does not mean claimants have been forgotten. He says 80% of the previously undisclosed claims have had some action taken on them in the past year. The Commission has already ordered an independent review of the way it collects data. The new Minister, Megan Woods, has talked about the need for change in the way EQC handles claims. Checkpoint will have more on this story after the news. The Child Poverty Action Group says the government's families package doesn't go far enough to help the very worst off children. The package is the $5.5 billion centrepiece of the government's push to tackle child poverty. It includes boosting working for families, the $60 a week Best Start payment for families with newborns, and a winter energy payment for beneficiaries and superannuitants. Treasury has projected it will lift 54,000 children out of poverty by 2021. But the Child Poverty Action Group says the poorest family need more money and the government should take steps to increase benefits and remove benefit sanctions. The Prime Minister has called the State House waiting list far too high and promised her government is doing everything it can to avoid another winter of people living in garages or cars. In 3 months, the social housing register has risen by 26%, almost doubling in the past 2 years. There are now nearly 8,000 families in need of accommodation. Jacinda Ardern says the government's temporary solution is doubling the amount of emergency housing available this winter. But she's pointed to this Thursday's budget for an announcement on the country's state housing situation.
I find those numbers staggering. They prove the challenge that's in front of us, but we're doing as much as we can to tackle it head on.
The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. The boss of the retail chain Briscoes has admitted he doesn't know how many of his employees haven't been getting paid for the last 15 minutes of their shifts. Some Briscoes staff last night had all of their shifts extended by 15 minutes after management realised they weren't being paid for the time it takes to cash up at the end of the day. Checkpoint alerted Briscoes Managing Director Rod Duke to their roster changes after he was this morning reassured by his managers the company had paid all staff properly. He said the news was absolutely appalling and he's investigating further. The bloodiest single day for Palestinians since 2014 has drawn condemnation and calls for restraint. Israeli troops shot dead dozens of Palestinian protesters on the Gaza border during the high-profile opening of the United States Embassy to Israel in Jerusalem by the Trump administration. The Palestinian Health Ministry officials said 58 protesters were killed and 2,700 injured by live gunfire, tear gas or other means. A regional power, Turkey, called it a massacre. The BBC's Jeremy Bowen says the Israeli reaction may now have derailed any peace process.
Through years of negotiations, Palestinians always knew the Americans would look after Israel's interests. But they also believed that the US wanted peace as a strategic objective, and they accepted American diplomats as honest brokers. That's history now. So far, there's no sign of the peace plan the Trump administration says it's working on. The US ambassador in Israel says the Palestinians need to accept new realities. The deadly events in Gaza show the desperation inside what many Palestinians call the world's biggest open prison.
Jeremy Bowen in Jerusalem. The Regional Development Minister, Shane Jones, is again criticising Air New Zealand, this time for putting up their domestic airfares. The national carrier has confirmed it's raising the price of its domestic flights by 5% from this Thursday. It says it's due to rising operational costs, such as the price of fuel and labour. Shane Jones says he's looked at the cost pressures and doesn't think a rise in costs for the regions is an acceptable response.
Air New Zealand enjoy a virtual monopoly position in New Zealand in terms of air connectivity, and the people who feel that Air New Zealand are doing a fantastic job obviously never fly to Whangarei.
The Regional Development Minister, Shane Jones. It's 5 minutes past 5. Sport. The former All Black and Manu Samoa coach Sir Brian Williams says not being involved in Super Rugby has left the Pacific Islands unions running on the smell of oily fumes. New Zealand Rugby is looking over a government commissioned study on the establishment of a Pacific Islands Super Rugby team from 2020. The team would be based in Suva and play some home games in Samoa, Tonga, Auckland and Sydney. Sir Brian says if it goes ahead, Pacific Rugby will rise.
One of the things that's been to the real detriment of Pacific Island Rugby is the fact that they're not involved in Super Rugby, and as a result they can't generate the sort of income that everyone else can. It's sort of hand to mouth for those unions at the moment. If it comes to pass, then that'll certainly be a big boost to Pacific Island Rugby.
Sir Brian Williams. The ANZ Premiership has launched a rare investigation following Northern Stars mid-quarter Fa'amu Ioane's sending off against the Mystics on Sunday. Umpires ordered Ioane off the court after persistent infringing, leaving her side a player short in the in the final quarter. They lost 54-60. The investigation is set to be completed by Friday. Australian Rugby League star Cameron Smith announced his retirement from all representative football effective immediately. Smith has admitted that last year's Origin and World Cup matches took their toll physically and mentally and said he felt now was the right time to step away. That's the news.
Clashes in Israel.
You could hear some of the large explosions. You could hear a constant machine gun fire and weapon fire as thousands and thousands of Palestinian protesters tested the border fence.
Explosions in Indonesia.
Very, very big sound. Just like a boom, the window is broken down from the top to the bottom.
And an Afghan journalist runs for parliament.
This is a country that's worth dying for. We have seen a lot of blood and sacrifices over the last 17 years or so.
Voices from the front line. Morning Report with Susie Ferguson and Guy and Espiner, weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, can an online quiz give good advice for taking supplements? Why health advocates are sounding warnings about the latest vitamin sales tactics. And after 10, when buildings become evidence. Sarah Nankerville explains the art of forensic architecture. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met service weather now through to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Waikato, also Coromandel Bay of Plenty and Taupō. Showers, some heavy with possible thunderstorms tomorrow. Waitomo, Taumaranui and Taranaki, periods of rain or showers with some heavy falls and thunderstorms easing tomorrow evening. For Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, fine spells. Whanganui, Taihape and Manawatu, cloudy periods. Scattered showers clearing this afternoon, but returning tomorrow afternoon, some heavy. Kapiti, Wellington and Wairarapa, mostly cloudy with showers, but longer fine spells about Wairarapa today. Rain tomorrow afternoon, briefly heavy. Nelson and Marlborough, periods of rain, heavy and possibly thundery at times, clearing tomorrow evening, apart from a few showers about the Kaikoura coast. Canterbury, also Bulla and Westland, mostly cloudy with scattered showers, but long fine spells about southern Westland tomorrow. Fiordland, Otago and Southland, mainly fine today, showers spreading north tomorrow morning and afternoon. The Chatham Islands, mostly cloudy with a few showers. It's 5:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thanks, Katrina, and thanks everyone for joining us. Coming up tonight on the program, we're in Jerusalem. In fact, we're there a couple of times tonight. But first, we're in our second largest city where two things of real significance have happened today, both of them earthquake related. Thing one, a class action proceeding brought by a group of Southern Response customers has been settled, finally settled. If that doesn't mean anything to you, we'll explain it at length with a background story later in the program. But in short, when it became apparent AMI did not have enough money to meet the earthquake claims it was getting, the previous government cut and pasted AMI's earthquake exposure into a new Crown entity called Southern Response. We'll talk soon about what happened next and about this afternoon's breakthrough settlement. But first, EQC. Anyone who listens to Checkpoint on a regular basis, thank you by the way, will know that we've been drilling into its unresolved claims, and we've repeatedly sought to clarify the extent of outstanding claims against the Earthquake Commission. Well, today EQC announced there were 949 more of them. That's more claims than anyone, including the Minister, has previously been told. That means there are now 3,617 unresolved claims before EQC, a 35% increase on the previous figure. A short time ago, I asked Sid Miller, the CEO, what's gone on?
These are not lost claims, John. They've just been underreported. So we have been working on these claims. What's come about in terms of the way we try and we capture the reporting of our claims. We've had claims that are in individual work queues that people are working on, but they've not been mapped to our overall sort of total reporting figures. And when we've migrated our data from our old system, version 4, to our new system, that's how we found this problem.
Okay, but there's still 949 claims that the Minister doesn't know about, your shareholder, the government doesn't know about, the people of New Zealand don't know about. Once again, there is a sense that EQC, whether by accident or design, has been downplaying the extent of the problem.
Well, we've only just found this issue as when we've done the migration. I think the key bit here is that these claims, are being worked on. By putting in place this new system, this gives us the ability to operate our case management. I think our old system, the V4, it is very old. It's no longer going to be supported.
Sorry, forgive me, Mr. Miller.
Here.
949 claims have been underreported. How did that happen? It's the V4, is it?
Yeah, well, as I've said, it's the way the mapping works for the reporting, and so individuals will be working on these claims and have them in individual work queues. But if those work queues are not mapped to the overall reporting, then you get this problem. So yes, it is very disappointing, and this is what we're doing in terms of addressing it with V8. I've also brought in KPMG to do a full independent audit across the whole data migration process to ensure there's full reconciliation of the process here.
Right. What did the Minister say?
The Minister, when we spoke to her about this, she's obviously, disappointed we're in this position, explained the situation in terms of migrating from one system to a newer system, and she's obviously very supportive of the case management approach, and V8 does enable us to do that. But she is rightly disappointed that we're in this position. But equally as well, that she did take some comfort from the fact that we are working on these claims.
Of the 949 claimants that had not been reported, how many of those clients are yet to be seen?
When we did the first piece of analysis, we found 5 that had not been worked on, but we've since gone through those and spoken to the customers. And one thing I would like to add, John, is that we're also going to do is that we're going to speak to every customer who's got a claim with us, the 3,617, to give them a reassurance that we are working, we've got their claim. So that is something else we'll be doing as part of addressing this issue.
And what's the oldest claim of the 949, and particularly of the 5?
Some of these predate 2016. I think we've got about 70 that predate 2016.
And so they are still unresolved, 3 years on?
Some of these, about 70, are in that bracket, and they're all re-repairs. But yes, there's about 70 in that bracket.
Is that good enough?
No, it's not, and I've got work on to look at how do we actually accelerate these as well, in terms of we're continuing to work on our existing claims, but what we've seen as well is we've seen an uplift in claims over the last couple of months, and so we need to accelerate our settlement rate. So I've got work going on in that area to absolutely see how we can resolve claims quicker, and particularly addressing these that have been in the system, as you say, for up to 2-3 years.
Longer? Any longer than that?
There could be some longer than that. I don't know.
So that's Sid Miller, and we'll talk to the Minister about that later in the program. Does she have confidence in EQC? We'll ask her. The government's other sometimes contentious presence in Christchurch has been the insurer's southern response. This, as we said, and we'll explore this later too, was the safety net for AMI clients making earthquake claims, but sometimes it was a safety net that said no, or maybe, or That resulted in a class action against it, and today that was settled out of court. In short, a group of 24 customers had argued Southern Response had engaged in a deliberate strategy to deceive them and delay their claims. They've agreed to stop using such language. Southern Response has agreed to stop fighting them in court. Over the next few months, each claimant will meet with retired High Court Judge Sir Graham Pankhurst, who'll settle their cases individually. It's a major breakthrough. Lawyer Grant Cameron has led the class action. A short time ago, I asked him how the settlement had come about.
The parties have got together, have negotiated an agreement whereby the claimants can enter into a private process and get all their claims resolved in a much faster fashion than going through court.
And this is after you've gone through court, High Court, then the Appeal Court.
Yeah, I think the Court of Appeal cleared the way for the action to go ahead, said that everything was fit and proper for proceeding through the court process. And at that point, I think there was reflection on both sides of the fence, and it was agreed that we could move more quickly forward.
Why did it take a trip to the High Court and a trip to the Appeal Court to get to this? And I know that there has been an agreement around the language that can be used now, as is often the case when two parties that have fiercely disagreed agree to agree. But what has preceded this?
Well, basically, the fundamental problem has been some doubt in legal terms as to what a class action may or may not comprise. And so Southern Response took the view that probably in these circumstances this didn't amount to what's called a representative action under the High Court rules, and they wanted to test that. The Court of Appeals now clarified the position and said, yes, it is a representative action. So generally, I guess these people have clarified the law, but the way is clear to proceed through the courts for this sort of case, had that been desirable, but there is a better way of now resolving things.
Grant, it's been a tough, emotional rollercoaster ride for your claimants over a period of years, many years in some cases. Is this the end of it now, or is there still the settlement process to come?
Yeah, they do have to go through a process, but it's a very much more informal process. On one hand, the advantage of the court is that everybody has certainty as to what all the rules are. On the other, sometimes that can be a relatively inflexible process and necessarily will take a long period of time. The particular path that's been mapped out here, we have used before to resolve the Cave Creek fiasco and also another one, Lake Alice, I think about the year 2000. And these were complex sort of cases that, for a whole host of reasons, deserve to be put through a private sort of process. And I think this government has recognised the benefits of doing that for this particular group of people.
Grant Cameron mentioning the government there. We'll talk to Megan Woods later. Bob Burnett was one of the Southern Response claimants. He hasn't been able to live in his dream Huntsbury home since the decision to remove gibboard and not replace it with bracing weakened the structure of his home, causing it to bend out of shape. Bob maintains his insurer did more damage to his home than the earthquake itself. It's now likely to be a rebuild all these years on. He told me a short time ago how he was feeling about the settlement.
I'm feeling quite, hopefully, sort of mildly optimistic. And, it's been, I don't know if you remember talking to me 2 years ago.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, we were just discussing it. Yeah.
Up at my house. And that day we had Megan Woods and we had Andrew Little up at my house. And I was interviewed by you, and then there was the TV people too. But it seems like an awful long time ago, and it feels to me that this is a milestone, but also, it still might be 2 or 3 years before I'm back in my house, so it'll be a 10-year thing. And had I known after the earthquakes that it would be 10 years before I get my house back, I would have been dismayed, and I probably would have tried to do something myself and repair the house without worrying about the insurance company. So, but yeah, I think it's good to get Southern Response out of the picture, hopefully, and deal with people that are actually normal human beings that are going to help us get our house back. At the end of the day, the insurance company were the people that were supposed to help us in our time of need, and they've actually stopped us from getting our house back.
You said You felt optimism. It seems a somewhat qualified optimism because, as you say, there is still a process to go through and you still don't know yet what your settlement will be. But I wonder when you last felt even qualified optimism. How long has it been?
It's been quite mind-numbing, really, the whole thing. And I don't know what I could have done differently when you look back at it. And, you know, you always think there's people worse off than you. There's people that have lost their lives and things like that. There's definitely been winners and losers in the earthquake situation. And we've been one of the losers. But, you know, I just look back and think what could have been. And, you know, my children, they're now 7 and 10. You know, we had a 2-month-old baby and a 3-year-old, and they've had a different life. They should have grown up in the nice, warm, healthy, comfortable house up on the top of the hill that we'd planned for them to live in, but instead we've been bouncing around mouldy, substandard rentals, and that's just the life they've had. And frankly, you know, I don't get very emotional, but that upsets me. I think, you know, because of these people, because of the earthquake and because of how we've been mistreated, they haven't been able to enjoy the life that we intended them to.
And if we go back to your position as an AMI client, it was the life you thought you had insured to protect, right? That is the thing I sense from Southern Response clients has been the most upsetting and the most galling. You had an insurance policy and it became impossible for you to collect on it.
Yeah, you look at the legality of it and the sort of, you know, technically what they should have done. But then you sort of think about, well, can human beings be so callous and mistreat people so poorly because of money? And you know, like I said, these are the people that should have been there to help us. You know, they would say that it's been an extraordinary event, but you have insurance for extraordinary events. You wouldn't have insurance unless there was extraordinary events.
Bob Burnett talking to us earlier, one of the claimants. Will be back in Christchurch later in the program. Let's go to Jerusalem now. Fresh protests are expected in Gaza after the bloodiest day there since the 2014 war between Hamas and Israel. Palestinian medical officials say at least 55 people have been killed by the Israeli military, more than 2,000 injured during protests over the high-profile opening of the US embassy to Israel in Jerusalem, formerly in Tel Aviv, of course. That move has incensed Palestinians who claim eastern Jerusalem is the capital of a future Palestinian state. The bloodshed drew calls for restraint from France and Britain, while regional power Turkey described it as a massacre. The BBC's Middle East correspondent Jeremy Bowen begins our coverage.
Palestinians call these protests the Great March of Return. For many of the young people who rushed the border wire with Israel, it was a one-way journey. Israel used tear gas and bullets. The Prime Minister said the security forces were defending Israel's borders, its sovereignty, and its citizens. The dead and wounded, he said, were the fault of Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement that runs Gaza. Palestinians say that their rage comes from Israel's brutality and its denial of their right to independence. Protests and killing went on for most of the day. In Jerusalem, police scuffled with Israeli peace campaigners outside the new American embassy. For what is left of Israel's peace movement, this is a dark day. Inside, the US Marines showed their colors, and so has the Trump administration. It's broken with an international consensus that Jerusalem's status is undecided, so embassies should stay in Tel Aviv. President Trump's daughter Ivanka did the honors.
We welcome you officially and for the first time to the Embassy of the United States here in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. Thank you.
Her father appeared on video.
Israel is a sovereign nation with the right, like every other sovereign nation, to determine its own capital. Yet for many years we failed to acknowledge the obvious, the plain reality that Israel's capital is Jerusalem.
Ivanka's husband is a senior advisor to her father. They celebrated with Israel's Prime Minister.
What a glorious day. Remember this moment. This is history. President Trump, by recognizing history, you have made history.
Moving the embassy is a triumph for Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's a promise kept for President Trump, and most Israelis are happy. But so far, there's no evidence to back up Mr. Netanyahu's claim that it's good for peace. In Ramallah, on the West Bank, Palestinians demonstrated against what the Americans call the new realities and against old ones. For Palestinians, keys are symbols of the dispossession of 750,000 refugees never allowed back after Israel beat the Arabs in the 1948 war.
We're marching in the best traditions of Martin Luther King and Gandhi, peacefully, non-violently, insisting on our right for Jerusalem as our capital and for our right of return. Nothing will break us, not Netanyahu, not Israel, not the United States.
In Jerusalem's Old City at the weekend, Israelis distributed flowers to Palestinians, apologizing. They were apologizing for this, an annual march by nationalistic Israelis through the overwhelmingly Palestinian Muslim quarter. The parade celebrates Israel's capture of East Jerusalem from Jordan in the 1967 war. On the streets, the lead-up to today's events has been tense and angry. Mostly it was noise and insults. Sometimes it boiled over.
No one is saying that Arabs can't live here. God forbid, of course they can live here. But sovereignty is a different story.
You find it hard to say the word Palestinians, don't you?
There are Arabs living in this area.
Why don't you call them Palestinians?
There's no reason to.
Why?
Because there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. There never has been.
More people will suffer and die if leaders on both sides cannot calm this crisis. The Americans believe that with Saudi support they can persuade Palestinians to accept less than the state they want. But in Gaza, nearly 2 million people live with little hope, less patience, and a belief that they've lost enough.
The BBC's Jeremy Bowen will be back in Jerusalem and Gaza after the news at 6. Tempers flared today as hundreds marched onto Parliament grounds demanding the Crown recognise Māori tikanga or custom in the treaty settlement process. As the Treaty Negotiations Minister Andrew Little stood stony-faced, flanked by fellow Māori MPs, a kaumātua angrily challenged him to mana korehi reporter Te Aniwa Huri Hanganui was there.
Despite grey and drizzly weather, about 600 people joined iwi leaders from the far north, Auckland and Tauranga to protest over the issue of Māori tikanga and overlapping treaty claims. It was clear that the hikoi was there to send a message, and tensions bubbled over when it was the Minister of Treaty Negotiations' turn to speak, with one kaumātua taking offence at Andrew Little's rhetoric.
No! Not here to listen to any bullshit. My kaumātua made me, not me! Not me!
Protesters were there to raise the importance of tikanga or Māori protocol in the treaty process. Iwi leader Charlie Tawhiao says for Māori it's not the size of the settlement or the amount of land they will receive, but maintaining who they are. He says the tikanga process allows everyone to express their views face to face, consider them and make a decision based on consensus. It typically takes place on a marae rather than in a courtroom.
The Waitangi Tribunal has made some rulings in terms of interests of iwi in different places. The Crown has subsequently interpreted those rulings about interests to mean hard rights. Is that approach by the Crown and by some iwi blurs out all the nuances of tikanga Māori that allow for relationships to have a whole spectrum and layers of interests.
The Deputy Chair of Auckland Hapu, Ngāti Whātua o Rākei, Ngārumu Blair, says an issue is the government's refusal to acknowledge the importance of tikanga in common law.
The Crown for 4 years now has blocked us access to the courts, so they've been striking us out in the High Court and the Court of Appeal. They're saying we can't even have the argument about tikanga being a part of common law and that tikanga being part of the process in terms of decision making and how they weigh interests. It's disappointing that this government's carrying on like the last one and blocking that access, and we know what happened last time with that in 2004.
The catalyst for today's hikoi was a Supreme Court hearing between Ngāti Whātua o Rākei and the Crown on an overlapping treaty claim issue. Ngāti Whātua o Rākei has already settled its claim with the Crown, but it's angry the Crown is now offering other iwi properties that it believes are within its tribal boundaries. Mr Blair says over the past 4 years treaty settlements have been rushed, meaning the issue of cross-claims hasn't been resolved. He says if the government doesn't get this right, it gives Māori fresh grounds for contemporary claims and damages.
We're joined in court with Ngāti Kuri and Ngaiterangi, Ngāti Kuri from the far north. Waikato Tainu, we've also sent a memorandum into court. Ngāti Manuhiri have supported. Basically every tribe on the border of Parehauraki is supporting us and this case because they're experiencing similar issues of overreach by the Hauraki tribes.
Labour MP Tamati Coffey tried to smooth the waters, assuring those present their message had been clear.
You come here to send a message, a very strong message, a very beautiful message too, that we as parliamentarians, as decision makers, when we make decisions, we should be taking tikanga Māori into our decision-making processes.
But Andrew Little said later that for tikanga to work, iwi need to resolve issues amongst themselves, although he did say that Labour is committed to facilitating those discussions. In Wellington, for Checkpoint, Te Aniwa Hurihanganui.
Thanks for being with us on Checkpoint. Coming up, our reporter Zach Fleming continues his investigation into businesses underpaying staff on the minimum wage by expecting them to attend meetings or cash up or do other work after or before they've clocked on or off. The impact of Mycoplasma bovis in Waikato, where there Meghan Markle and Prince Harry have a quite difficult situation to deal with following revelations her father will not attend her wedding this weekend. We're back in Jerusalem, we're back in Christchurch, much more. Nona next with business, but before it all, Katrina Batten with the headlines.
Who's going to give her away?
I don't know,
Okay.
Katrina.
I'll have to listen to the
Okay, right, thank you.
Sorry. EQC says it's found almost 1,000 more unresolved claims in Christchurch than it thought. This means some 3,500 claims are still open 7 years after the earthquakes. The Commission's chief executive says it already has ordered an independent review of the way it collects data. The new minister, Megan Woods, has talked about the need for change in the way EQC handles claims. The Child Poverty Action Group says the government's families package doesn't go far enough. The package is the $5.5 billion centrepiece of the government's push to tackle child poverty. But the Child Poverty Action Group says the poorest families with the very worst off children need more money, and it's calling for a rise in benefits. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has called the State House waiting list far too high and promised her government is doing everything it can to avoid another winter of people living in garages or cars. Briscoe's Managing Director Rod Duke says news that some employees were not paid for the last quarter hour of their shifts is absolutely appalling. Some Briscoe staff have had all their shifts extended by 15 minutes after management realised they weren't being paid for the time it takes to cash up at the end of the day. Mr Duke says he's investigating further. Palestinians protesting over the moving of the US Embassy to Jerusalem have been told by the American ambassador they must accept a new reality. 58 Palestinians are dead and almost 3,000 injured in a single day of violence. And there's no sign of the peace plan the Trump administration claims to be working on. The Regional Development Minister is taking Air New Zealand to task for again raising its domestic fares. The airline says the latest rise from Thursday is due to increased operational costs such as fuel and labour. But Shane Jones says those who think Air New Zealand's doing a good job obviously never fly to whangarei. Those are the headlines. I'm back at 6.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten. We'll try and get an answer for you between now and then.
These are questions I need to know.
Let's, before we go to Nona, go to another piece of business news, because we're going to continue our investigation into retailers not paying their employees for all their work. Tonight we can reveal 2 more employers who appear to have been doing this: footwear chain Hannah's and Briscoe's. Briscoe's has today extended the shifts of some of its employees by 15 minutes after being caught forcing them to cash up unpaid in the evenings. That's despite Managing Director Rod Duke receiving assurances this morning that every store was running by the book. So Mr Duke, it appears, has no idea how many of his 2,500 employees have been forced to work for periods of time unpaid, and Hannah's has admitted if their stores close late, staff aren't paid for that overtime. Those chains join Smith City and Spotlight, who were caught forcing employees to attend a daily morning meeting unpaid. Since those stories last week and last night by Zach Fleming, we've been contacted by dozens of workers from dozens of companies, and the government is now saying the practice seems so widespread it needs to hire more labour inspectors to keep businesses honest. We are learning more every day. Zach Fleming with the latest.
Our roster ends at 6, so everything after 6 is unpaid.
We're not naming this Auckland Briscoe's employee, but he's on the minimum wage and says he's never been paid for the last 15 minutes of his shifts for the year and a half he's worked there. Then, last night, after 4 days of media stories about unpaid work, his roster changed.
All of my shifts that are on there are ending 15 minutes later than normal.
And so that will mean that now you'll be getting paid for cash up?
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
Earlier this afternoon, I called Briscoe's Managing Director Rod Duke. He'd just got out of a long meeting, seeking assurances his business is operating legally and ethically.
That people are getting paid for the hours that they're actually working. So that was my project.
And is it happening?
Absolutely.
Then I told him about the Auckland employee you just heard from.
That's absolutely appalling. Completely against company practice. And I'm going to investigate that absolutely right now.
So what changed overnight though, Rod? Because there was clearly, at some point, all of his shifts have now been extended by 15 minutes. So someone must have realised that what was happening was wrong.
We have put a call into every store in the last 24, 48 hours and got an indication from all the stores that they've been operating the rosters as per company policy.
So can we then take that to mean that the person who assured you that store was running correctly, it actually wasn't, and they've just fixed their problem?
I'm going to check that out, and I'm going to check that out very, very, very shortly.
Yeah, and if we can...
Because that's the impression I would get too.
I put to Mr Duke that it's more than likely this isn't an isolated case.
Well, and look, Zach, you may or may not be correct. I don't know.
He has no idea how many employees within his company have been, in his own words, cheated out of money. It's a common theme. Last night we revealed Spotlight has, for at least a decade, demanded staff attend a 15-minute morning meeting unpaid, despite the top-down directive being that that meeting was voluntary. Spotlight's now launched an internal investigation, a check on how many employees have been cheated out of money, and promised to pay back anyone affected.
So at the end of my shift, that coincides with the end of the store closing, we are to stay behind and finish the day's work. So that's like the vacuuming, that could be restocking the shelves, and we're to wait until whoever's in charge finishes cashing up, and then we may leave, but we don't get paid after the store is closed.
How long does that usually take?
Usually about 10 to 15 minutes.
That's a minimum wage worker at footwear chain Hannah's. We aren't naming her either because she's fearful of repercussions from her manager for speaking out. 15 minutes unpaid work a day works out to around $800 a year.
It's been a cause of a lot of stress, if I'm being honest. What I get paid isn't enough to cover my bills, and to work that extra without being paid, it's made me feel quite stressed, quite down.
And yet she hasn't raised it with her regional manager. Because of the huge power imbalance, she needs her job more than Hannah's needs her.
Because we're such a big company and I'm just one person, and I feel that if I say something, I may face repercussions.
The executive director of Hannah's, Roger Harper, acknowledged today that some Hannah's workers aren't being paid for all the work they do, but he said he only learned of that today.
Yes, they are paid for fixed hours, so yes, there may be circumstances. There's not an expectation from that point of view from the company, but there may be situations where people are working over the closing time of the store.
Are you happy with people not being paid for the full work they are doing, or would you like to see that change?
I would love to see that change. Definitely not happy about that, and very, very keen to see it change.
Mr Harper says any Hannah's employee who can prove they worked overtime without pay will be reimbursed. And if you're a Briscoe's employee who hasn't been paid for morning meetings or cash up, here's what Managing Director Rod Duke wants you to do.
I would encourage every single person who works within the company to notify me personally if in fact they think that's happening.
How do they do that?
They ring me, just exactly the same way you did, Zach.
For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
Do get in touch if you are somewhere else, another employer who is doing something similar, 2101. Let's stay with business news. Nona Peltier sitting beside me in the studio. Hi, Nona. Nearly half of business leaders strongly support making KiwiSaver contributions compulsory. Why? What's driving that?
Well, they think that that's a very positive thing for the economy. And these days, we're seeing business surveys which indicate increasingly that there's a lot of negativity around it. So this particular finding in this most recent survey by Staples Rodway, it was a pre-budget survey of 500 business leaders. It was a really negative result, that survey overall, and so it was a bit of a push to find something bright. And one of the things that did come across was this idea that if you made KiwiSaver compulsory, it would help the economy, it would be good for their employees, it would be a positive thing. Overall, though, there was a lot of negativity around the upcoming budget. There more than half, or about half, of the business leaders didn't think that the government could actually manage the economy well, and were pretty much pessimistic about the outcome of that budget and how it would look, how it would play into business. Yeah,
it's going to be fascinating to see the business response to the government. And in part, this is a tribal divide. I mean, business has historically voted national, right? But it will be really interesting to see the response post-budget on Tuesday.
I think it's just simply that businesses don't like change, and a lot of people don't.
Fletcher Building. Their shares a strong rise this morning after it was confirmed that it will stay part of a key overseas investment index. What does that mean, and why does it matter?
Well, okay, so international investors primarily look at New Zealand as a sort of a destination, and there's a key index. It's sort of passive funds. If you put your money in KiwiSaver, for example, or other kind of fund overseas, you invest in New Zealand, you invest in a basket of our biggest and blue chip companies. Fletcher Building has been in that index for a long time, along with others. There was about 7 of them, including Mercury Energy. Well, the expectation was that Fletcher Building would come out because it had lost about $1 billion on its building and interiors business, which drove its share price down. And A2 Milk, which is the new largest company worth $10 billion, would come in. Well, A2 Milk did come in, but it wasn't Fletcher Building that went out. No, it was Mercury, the power company. And that's partly because it's, 52% held by the government anyway, so what difference does it really make to them?
So what do the Fletcher shares do?
Well, hey, and then we had some late news as well from Fletcher that they finally made a deal with their bankers after losing, all that money. The bank, they broke their banking covenants.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyways, they managed to get a deal in line with their expectations, so that was another bit of good news for Fletcher today.
But the Fletcher shareholders haven't had much of that lately, have they?
No, so the market fell a little bit, but Fletcher Building shares, they rose 3% against the market, so that was good. A2 Milk fell about 1.5%, Mercury dropped about 1.4%. Overall, our index fell a handful of points. We closed down 4 points to 8,709, in case you were wondering.
Yeah, thank you, Nona. And what did the dollar do?
Actually, the dollar's been a bit weaker overnight, and that's partly because of, you know, other things outside of our control.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the way it is. 69 US cents, 91.8 Australian, and 50.9 pence.
They're still drifting below 70 US.
Yeah, it might stay down there for a while because, you know, interest rates in the United States, oil prices are higher, a little unsettlement, I guess, about the trade still in the air with China and so on. So you'd expect that for a while.
Nona Peltier, thank you very much indeed. Poor buggers. That's the view of one Waikato farmer after the region's first confirmed case yesterday of the cattle disease Mycoplasma bovis. There are now 39 infected properties nationwide. That was the first in Waikato and the northernmost so far. Our reporter Sally Murphy has spent the day in the Waikato region.
The manager of a farm in Cambridge, Louise Cook, first heard Mycoplasma bovis was in the region on social media yesterday.
The first reaction is just really concerned and conscious of the feelings of the farmers that are directly involved. So it's got to be really difficult for them on the coalface, and that's probably your first response as a farmer, is to say, yeah, poor buggers.
The local vet says they've had multiple calls from farmers asking where the infected farm is and what to look out for. With livelihoods at risk, Ms Cook says the close farming community will be supporting each other.
I think everyone's in a similar headspace, which is, okay, so it's here, that changes how worried we are. We've known that Mycoplasma was down south, and then there was the Hawke's Bay, and then there was the Wairarapa, but you go, it's in the region. Okay, so the risk for us is now heightened. We've got to consider how we protect ourselves.
The region's dairy representative at Federated Farmers, Ben Moore, says authorities and industry groups are organising a public meeting in Cambridge next week.
It's just education for farmers to come along, voice their opinions to MPI. There will be a couple of MPs there as well, and it's basically just to get a feel on where the temperament is and where to go to next.
At Louise Cook's farm, they've been checking vehicles and boot washing since the first infection was found in the South Island last year.
We've got an industry, we've got to protect it. It's the backbone of New Zealand economy is agriculture, so everyone is invested in seeing it be a strong and healthy industry moving forward.
Biosecurity officials discovered the infected Cambridge farm through its tracing system. Jeff Gwynn says they're focusing on stock movements off that property, and other farms are also being monitored.
There's at least 2 that are under a restricted place, and there are a number that are under notice of direction.
Next month is Gypsy Day, when many share milkers and their cows move to other farms. Jeff Gwynn says herd owners already under regulatory control will know exactly what they can and can't do, but others need to ensure their tracing and health records are up to date.
At the moment, what my focus is ensuring that where we understand the disease to be, and those are the properties under regulatory control, that we control those movements. Other than that, I think, you know, as long as farmers take sensible precautions, they should be able to minimise the risk. But there is no zero risk yet, because there may be a herd out there we haven't found yet. Let's be upfront about that. But it will be in the minority, or if at all.
Jeff Gwynn says at this stage it's looking less likely the disease can be eradicated, and farmers will have to learn to manage it. From Cambridge for Checkpoint, Sally Murphy.
Just gone 13 minutes to 6. New figures show the waiting list for state housing has hit an all-time high. And the government has also been forced to hike its maximum prices for Kiwi-built homes in Auckland and Queenstown by $50,000 due to the rising cost of building materials and land. The state of the country's housing market has been highlighted again just 2 days out from the coalition government's first budget. Political reporter Benedict Collins has the story.
Check for spelling mistakes. So far, so good.
The Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, made the traditional ministerial inspection at the printing press in Petone this morning. It will be Mr Robertson's first budget.
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting process putting a budget together, and it's not my own blood, sweat and tears. It's the work of, you know, ministers, of the many officials, the Treasury in particular, who do just a sterling job.
And it's clear social housing will be one of the big focuses of Thursday's budget. It was revealed today that the demand for public housing in New Zealand is at a record high. There are nearly 8,000 families and individuals on the waiting list for public housing, and 2,000 more looking to shift to a different state house. The Housing Minister, Phil Twyford, says the government's working as fast as it can.
Waiting list is shockingly high. It's getting close to 10,000. It's gone up by 26% in the last 3 months. I think it's people coming forward for help because they know there's a government now that not only recognises there's a housing crisis, but has said it's going to do its damnedest to put a decent roof over the heads of people who need it. And in Thursday's budget, we'll be making some more announcements about building more houses.
The government came under fire today for raising the maximum price of its Kiwi-built homes in Auckland and Queenstown by $50,000. It wants to build 100,000 affordable homes for first-home buyers over the next 10 years. Phil Twyford was forced to justify the rising price after getting a grilling from Judith Collins in Parliament.
Mr Speaker, we raised the price points, the maximum prices in Auckland and Queenstown to $500,000 for one bedroom, $600,000 for two bedroom place, $650,000 for 3 bedrooms or more. For houses outside Auckland and Queenstown, the maximum price is $500,000 for all houses. We made the decision based on advice from both industry and the public service.
Jacinda Ardern acknowledges the new $650,000 price tags for 3-bedroom homes won't be seen as affordable by many, but says it's better than what exists now.
They have no chance at this point of over $1 million, and that's where the average price is at the moment. We're doing everything we can to bring it down. We are looking at shared equity and other options to try and make it as accessible as possible, but the alternative is to do nothing.
But are you on a hiding to nothing with this policy, given that even since the election the costs have been rising and they're now into a sphere where very few people would actually consider them affordable?
You know, some of the data and research I've seen has suggested that first home buyers are in the 700,000 range at the moment. We're trying to get lower than that.
But National leader Simon Bridges says Labour's flagship Kiwi Build policy is a sham.
Effectively what Kiwi Build is coming in and buying up what was already happening and slapping a Kiwi Build label on it. Well, that's Kiwi hoax, isn't it? It's Kiwi fraud.
Do you think the prices will keep on going up?
Yeah, I think that's probably likely actually, because they're not fundamentally putting in lots of new supply. It's the supply that's already there.
National says Phil Twyford had promised to make it easier for New Zealanders to own their own homes, but so far he's doing the opposite. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Benedict Collins.
A woman whose son is on trial for murdering her husband has told a court how he cradled his dying father in his arms as he apologised for what he'd done. Wide-ranging suppression orders prevent RNZ from naming her husband or her son. Through tears, the woman told the High Court in Auckland today how her children had been beaten and watched as she was beaten by their father. Edward Gay reports.
The woman, aged in her 40s, wept as she recalled her family life in a provincial centre. She said her husband would frequently leave home for weeks at a time.
I was just at home raising the kids on my own most of the time. So yeah, it was pretty hard to put food on the table with them not around.
But things only got harder when her husband returned.
He'd just come home and start accusing me of just going out and sleeping around, and then he would think that I was having affairs with his family members, and then he'd just give me hidings for it.
She said she tried to shelter her children from the violence, but she couldn't always protect them. Her husband would also get angry with his son because after doing time in prison, his own boy didn't recognise him.
He would just grab him and boot his ass like really hard, or slap him across the head, just stuff like that.
There were occasions when her son would stick up for her, particularly when he was a teenager.
We were arguing, and our son came running into the sitting room to try and calm the situation down, and his father looked at him like he was there to take him on. So he grabbed him and he just head-butted him in the face and almost broke his nose.
She said she and her husband became addicted to methamphetamine and decided to move to Auckland to enrol in a rehab program. The violence stopped for a time, but she said her husband got back on the drugs and began hitting her again. She said there was a particularly nasty incident when he bundled her and the children into the car and drove them out of town.
And then he took us out for a ride up to, I don't know where it was like out away from all the homes and that. It was like in a paddock. He took us out there and he gave me a good hiding out there in front of the kids.
On the night her husband died, the woman told the court she found text messages on his phone from another woman and an argument started.
And then I said to him, "She's ugly," and he goes, "Well, you're going to be ugly too." And then he just started hitting me.
The beating happened in front of her baby. The woman was eventually able to pick up her baby and get out of the house. Despite injuries to her face and both eyes swelling up, she made the half-hour walk to her son and daughter's home.
They just broke down crying when they saw my face. They were just so hurt. They hadn't seen me like that before.
But her husband followed her. The woman said he demanded the keys to his daughter's car. Her husband also told his son to collect his mother's things. He left but returned a short time later. This time they locked him out of the house.
He was outside just walking around the house, just banging on the windows and screaming at us all. And then he went to the front door and he was trying to kick it in. And we were all just inside, just scared as we didn't know what to do.
Her husband was threatening to smash up his son's car. She was asked how her son was feeling at the time.
He was scared and he was worried. I think he saw it as he had to try and protect us from his father.
She said she told her children to call the police and saw the lights of a car leave. A short time later, her son left the house and she heard scuffling. She went outside to see her son and husband fighting. They disappeared around the corner of the house, and when she caught up to them, she could see her husband on top of her son, punching him in the face.
I just pulled him. I was just trying to pull him back. And he was just too strong. He was just too strong, and I got to try to pull him up. And all I could hear was my son's whimpers.
She said a short time later, her husband called out that he'd been stabbed.
And I just remember my son with his father in his arms. And he was just saying, "I'm sorry, Dad, look what you made me do. I'm sorry, Dad." And then when the lights went on, we just saw the blood.
Her husband had been stabbed 6 times and died at the scene. The trial before Justice Duffy and a jury continues. Mo te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Edward Gaiaho.
4.5 minutes to 6. We're getting a lot of feedback again from people who say they work for employers who require them to do work either before or after their formally paid day. If you are getting in touch with us via 2101 or email, we will get back in touch with you. So we won't use those specific cases tonight, but this one kind of sums up the feedback we're getting. Good on you, John, getting all these workers to tell us how they're being ripped off. Actually, it's great work by our reporter, Zach Fleming. How many more, eh? Terrible. What a disgusting society. It seems it has become the norm for too many businesses, says Yvonne from Levin. Someone says there is theft as a servant as an offence. Is there an equivalent offence for the master? That's John asking that question. Hi Checkpoint, Stephen here. I work as a casual in retail, won't name the business, and sometimes I stay 10 or 15 minutes to cash up after close, but I think this is silly. I choose to do this because I have pride in my work. I have pride in working where I do, so I don't complain. I work hard to get the job done, even if I miss out on an extra $5 or whatever. Please note, most nights I've given an option to leave but choose to stay unpaid because of my passion for my retail job. Olivia says, hi John, while I don't work for an hourly wage, I work for a salary. There is a huge expectation and pressure to stay later than the 9 hours per day I'm contracted to. While it's terrible these people aren't being reimbursed for their time, there are also people on salaries who are getting less than the minimum wage per hour due to the small clause in many contracts that says extra hours may have to be worked as required. I don't think this is fair either. Thank you. Why has the Labour Inspectorate just woken up? This listener asks, what have they been up to for the last 20 years? Well, they might tell you that they have been under-resourced in terms of their ability with their staff numbers to police some of the stuff, but we will try and make some calls on that. It's a good question and a fair and reasonable one to ask them. As always, thank you for your feedback. We appreciate it. 2101 or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. Now, Katrina Batten wants to know who's going to walk Megan down the aisle if her father doesn't. I've no idea whether the story answers the question. But Katrina, if you're listening, although she's probably walking down the stairs to the studio, this one's for you. Meghan Markle, now there she is, she just wanted into control. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry are dealing with what's described as a difficult situation today after a report in the US that the father will no longer be attending the royal wedding. CNN's Kirsten Holmes is at Windsor.
A potential royal pain ahead of a royal wedding. Meghan Markle's father telling TMZ he will no longer attend her wedding to Prince Harry. The reason? These staged photos. Thomas Markle said he worked with an agency to orchestrate photos of himself preparing for the wedding. Kensington Palace had recently said the 73-year-old would walk his daughter down the aisle, but Markle now says he doesn't want to embarrass her or the royal family. With just days until the nuptials taking place here at Windsor Castle, the palace has issued a statement from the couple, asking for, quote, understanding and respect to be extended to Mr. Markle in this difficult situation. The news casting a cloud over the fairy tale love story.
He got on one knee.
The two met on a blind date in 2016, and Saturday they will exchange vows surrounded by friends and family. The country is readying for lots of excitement and lots of people. Security in Windsor has been ramped up for weeks, preparing for one of the largest operations the force has ever undertaken.
At the end of the day, it is a royal wedding with two people who fall in love and should have a happy day.
Thames Valley Police Sergeant Andy Turner. Wasn't it lovely? Wasn't it comforting to hear his voice as being in charge of security, if he is, or whether he's just a local who happened to be passing. Ending that report from CNN's Kirsten Holmes. Andy Turner, what a great day he's in for, eh? The Thames Valley Police Sergeant. After 6, we're going back to Christchurch. Two big stories out of there today. The EQC, 940 more unresolved claims to add to the pile, and also the Southern Response settlement. We're going to background the Southern Response story for those of you who don't know what it's about, and we're also going to talk to the Minister about both stories. That's coming up after the news, but first the pips.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi o te pō, good evening, ko Katrina Batanaho. The Earthquake Commission has discovered it's close to 1,000 more unresolved earthquake claims in Christchurch than it previously thought. This brings the total number of open claims to 3,500. The Commission says it discovered the oversight when it upgraded its systems and began attaching case managers to claimants. Its Chief Executive Sid Miller says he's disappointed to find out the Commission has been underreporting the number of cases still on its books. He told Checkpoint the underreporting was not deliberate.
We've had claims that are in individual work queues that people are working on, but they've not been mapped to our overall sort of total reporting figures. And when we've migrated our data from our old system, version 4, to our new system, that's how we found this problem.
Sid Miller says an independent inquiry into how EQC collects data is already underway. The Child Poverty Action Group says the government's families package doesn't go far enough to help the very worst off children. The package is the $5.5 billion centrepiece of the government's push to tackle child poverty. It includes boosting Working for Families, the $60 a week Best Start payment for families with newborns, and a winter energy payment for beneficiaries and superannuitants. But Susan St John from the Child Poverty Action Group says it doesn't do enough to help the poorest families.
While the families package will certainly help, it's only a drop in the bucket compared to what these families actually need to be restored to some kind of adequacy.
Susan St John. The Finance Minister Grant Robertson says the government needs to do more alongside the families package to improve outcomes for children. Fresh anti-Israel protests are expected in Gaza this evening on the 70th anniversary of the founding of Israel, and a day after Israeli soldiers killed at least 55 Palestinians in border clashes. There's been international condemnation of the violence by the Israeli military. However, the US continues to staunchly back Israel. The BBC's John Sopel reports.
The White House pinned the blame firmly on Hamas for the eruption of deadly violence on the Israel-Gaza border. A year ago, there was confident talk from President Trump of delivering the greatest deal ever, a Middle East peace settlement. But since his announcement that the US Embassy would move to Jerusalem, a decision that infuriated the Arab world, there's been a total impasse, with the Palestinians cutting all contacts with this administration.
John Sopel in Washington. The Treaty Negotiations Minister says Labour is committed to helping Māori sort out overlapping treaty claims through traditional Māori protocol. There was a dramatic exchange on Parliament's forecourt this morning when a kaumātua challenged the Minister, Andrew Little, and threatened him. Te Anawa Hurihanganui reports.
Hundreds marched, demanding the Crown recognise Māori tikanga in the treaty settlement process. Tensions boiled over when Mr Little came to speak, and one kaumātua took offence at the minister's rhetoric.
When they are not talking, then how does it get fixed? You can go off to court, I suppose,
Protesters want to raise the importance of tikanga or Māori protocol in the treaty process. They also object to land being offered that one iwi believes it owns to another. Mr Little says the issue will only be resolved when they talk together. This is Te Aniwa Hurihanganui.
Air New Zealand has confirmed it's raising the price of its domestic flights by 5% from this Thursday. The carrier says it's unable to absorb rising operational costs such as the price of fuel and labour. The airline says it regularly changes flight prices across routes and fare classes, and this won't have a material impact on its business operations. Australian authorities have told athletes who disappeared from last month's Commonwealth Games to hand themselves in by the end of today or face deportation. Up to 19 athletes disappeared during the Games, including a third of the Cameroonian team, sparking a nationwide search. The BBC's Hull Griffiths reports.
The athletes from Cameroon, Uganda, Rwanda and Sierra Leone all disappeared from their accommodation on the Gold Coast, some without even competing. The Cameroon team's chef de mission branded his country's missing boxers and weightlifters deserters. Until now, they've been in the country legally, but in order to remain, they must lodge a formal claim for refugee status before their visas expire at the end of the day. The BBC understands several athletes have taken legal advice from an asylum resource centre in Melbourne. Others are understood to have travelled to Sydney and Brisbane.
Hal Griffiths in Sydney. It's 6:05. Sport. The New Zealand women's squash #1, Joelle King, says the British Open remains dear to her heart as she attempts to gain success at the prestigious event. King, the 4th seed, will play fellow New Zealander Amanda Landers-Murphy in the first round in Hull tomorrow morning. The last New Zealander to win the British Open title was Leilani Joyce in 2000, while Dame Susan Devoy won it 8 times between 1984 and 1992. King, who won 2 gold medals at last month's Commonwealth Games, says New Zealand's history in the event makes it special for her.
It's a different kind of pressure coming in now. I haven't been seeded this high since before my injury. I've said time and time again this year that the main focus has been just to play the best squash I can play, and you can't go too far wrong if you're thinking that way.
Joelle King. Paul Cole is in the men's draw. The Nelson cyclist George Bennett expects the gaps to open up in the coming days as the second week of the Giro d'Italia gets underway tonight. Bennett is in 7th place overall, 93 seconds behind Englishman Simeon Yates. The peloton has just enjoyed a rest day. There are a few hill climbs later in the week, and Bennett says the fatigue is starting to show.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see those gaps creep in and the guys cracking, and no one feels that good anymore, More to come for sure, I hope. Hopefully from me, but definitely a lot more racing to come and the hardest racing to come for sure.
George Bennett. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Nick Bollinger reviews the new album from our guests on last week's Sofa Session. The Wellington crooners Hans Puckett. We have a window on the world of Chinese football. While this week's after-dinner speaker is our astronomer Alan Gilmore, who has information on how to use a star chart, along with the latest on efforts to map the Milky Way. Heaven help us if Google get there first.
And unlike Brian, I can't tell you exactly what we're up to because it's an ever-changing landscape as we head towards 10 p.m. I do know we'll wrap up the day's news in the long bulletin at 10, and I'll be talking to newsmakers from around the country with an eye on international events from the foreign desk. That's Lately with Karen Hay, live between 10 and 11 weeknights on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow, Northland to Waikato, also Coromandel Bay, plenty in Taupo. Showers, some heavy, with possible thunderstorms tomorrow. Waitomo, Taumaranui and Taranaki, periods of rain or showers, with some heavy falls and thunderstorms easing tomorrow evening. Figersbit and Hawke's Bay, fine spells. Whanganui, Taihepe and Manawatu, cloudy periods. Scattered showers clearing this afternoon, but returning tomorrow afternoon, some heavy. Kapiti, Wellington and Wairarapa, mostly cloudy with showers, but longer fine spells about Wairarapa today. Rain tomorrow afternoon, briefly heavy. Nelson and Marlborough, periods of rain, heavy and possibly thundery at times, clearing tomorrow evening, apart from a few showers about the Kaikoura coast. Canterbury, also Bulla and Westland, mostly cloudy with scattered showers, but long fine spells about southern Westland tomorrow. For Fiordland, Otago and Southland, mainly fine today. Showers spreading north tomorrow morning and afternoon, and the Chatham Islands mostly cloudy with a few showers. It's 6:08, and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten, and thank you everyone for being with us. We're going to return now to the two big stories out of Christchurch today. In a moment, we'll talk to the EQC Minister about those figures out this afternoon. In short, EQC announced there were 949 more unresolved claims than anyone, including the Minister herself, has previously been told. That means there are now 3,617 unresolved claims before EQC, a 35% increase on the previous figure. We spoke to Sid Miller earlier. We also spoke to lawyer Grant Cameron about the other big announcement out of our second largest city. And this one was a breakthrough. In short, Southern Response and the 24 customers taking a class action against it have settled. The settlement means the claimants will get their cases assessed and settlements determined by a retired High Court judge. Now, for those of you who don't know this story, let's look back over what's happened to this point.
You start living this every day because you're just not getting anywhere with them. You know, like you try and settle. You've got an insurance policy, and believe you me, the very last thing I'd want to enter into with the government is an insurance policy. So we had a private insurer, and by default, we ended up with the government.
That's Brian Kinder, one of the class action claimants, talking to us on Checkpoint in December of 2016. Southern Response was the post-quake rubble of private insurer AMI. Under immense pressure due to the number of earthquake claims it was facing, AMI was simply too big to fail. A response was required, and it came, but was controversial. Non-earthquake business was sold to IAG, and the earthquake business was converted into a Crown entity named Southern Response. It was meant to be a solution.
But basically, Southern Response have just been categorically refusing to settle us all the way through. We've spent countless hours on it, and there's been countless tears at home. I mean, these people just do not know what they do to family life. They just are absolutely heartless.
Story after story began to surface like that.
Show your passion, people. Be sincere.
In December 2013, claimants met then CEO Peter Rose outside the company's Addington office to pass over their claim details and their complaints. I was there that day. It was 4.5 years ago, and people were already angry.
There you go, Peter. That's the same information I've sent you every single day for the last 6 months.
That was Cam Preston handing his information over in the wind. Earlier this year, by the way, he would learn that Southern Response had put him under Thompson and Clark surveillance. One by one that day, claimants approached Peter Rose.
I'm suing Southern Response in the High Court.
The protests were coordinated, but the legal action wasn't. A growing number of cases against Southern Response essentially replicating each other. And Brian Kinder told us individually they were hitting a wall.
And then we come across Grant Cameron, who has really got things going for us.
That became the class action, which Southern Response strongly opposed, saying the claims were too disparate to be joined. So Southern Response, spending government money, went to court to fight against the right for the class action to even exist. And last October, lawyer Grant Cameron joined us live on Checkpoint with news of victory in the Court of Appeal and a sense the legal battles might now be over.
I think the Court of Appeal decision is very clear. It accords very much with previous Supreme Court guidance on these issues. And I do think the change of government will have a big effect. Megan Woods is thoroughly familiar with the pain and strain faced by people in Christchurch, and I think they'll be concerned to get this matter resolved.
That was 7 months ago, and it appears Grant Cameron was right. For Brian Kinder, who spoke to us before that victory, it had been a battle without end.
Absolute stonewall of it really is the classic delay, deny, defend. It really is.
Or was. It now appears the protracted fight against an insurer they never intended to be with is over. And what was the spine Grant Cameron had argued in court united the Southern Response policyholders?
The argument put forward, the allegation is that Southern Response engaged in a deliberate strategy designed to deceive policyholders and delay claims with a view to reducing the financial liability that it had to its policyholders.
Grant Cameron, interestingly, that's the kind of language the claimants will now not use as part of the agreement between Southern Response and their clients. The other Christchurch story of the day was the extra 949 unresolved claims EQC has discovered it has. Grand total up 35% on the previous number to 3,600. I asked EQC Minister Megan Woods what she makes of all of this.
Oh, look, it's obviously disappointing and it's obviously frustrating, but what I am pleased about is that EQC is doing the work to reveal these. That sometimes when you lift the hood, you do find what's broken. And what is most important to me as Minister is that there is a plan in place to settle people's claims and to find out exactly where the problems are. It's been evident for the last few years that there's been problems with the systems, and I've asked EQC to prioritise fixing it. And when you go about fixing things, you find problems.
Right, and what you find is invariably the problems are bigger. That's the thing that strikes me. So if stuff was constantly being underreported and the magnitude of the issue was constantly being underreported, was that by accident or design?
Well, look, I can't speak to that. What I can speak to is that what I've done in the time that I've been Minister. And I've made it a priority to keep very closely to the numbers since we've done the work this year, to appoint an independent ministerial advisor, to receive those very regular updates on where the numbers are at, and to really encourage EQC to bring the problems out into the sunlight and to work on getting solutions. Because the most important thing for me is that we find a way through for these people that don't have their claims settled and can't get on with their lives.
Yeah, isn't the sunlight the only place for them? I mean, I don't understand why we're making a virtue of necessity here. They should have been in the sunlight all along, shouldn't they?
Oh, absolutely. I would have much preferred, and I'm on record for the last few years, as saying that we needed greater transparency. But the important thing that we do now is have a plan in place that we can make sure these claims are settled. It is obviously frustrating, it is obviously disappointing that we're still seeing these claims come through now and that the systems aren't there to ensure that we've got robust practices. But what I am committed to doing is working very closely with EQC to ensure that we do get that in place.
Does Sid Miller have your confidence?
Yes, he does.
Sorry, I just want to take that answer. Yes, he does. Is he the change agent you represent him as? Or is he just a softer, friendlier Stonewall?
Look, I mean, in terms of the problems we're seeing today, I think we have to be fair. These problems go back years, way before Sid was leading EQC. These are systemic problems of the kind of systems that were put in place to manage large amounts of data. They weren't dealt with at the time. The right systems weren't put in place. And Sid has been willing to front up to what the problems are and look for solutions around them.
In terms of solutions, Southern Response, this is a major step forward for everyone, isn't it?
Oh, look, it is. I'm absolutely over the moon that we're able to see the progress that can be made when people are willing to think a bit innovatively and to be a bit creative. We've got to use those kind of skills to find ways forward in Canterbury, and it's what I'm committed to doing.
Yes, also you get forward when the Crown isn't litigiously defensive. I just wonder now, and we asked this question last year and no one would answer it, how much money Southern Response spent trying not to have a class action against it. In the High Court and the Appeal Court, we're told it was millions of dollars. That money now looks to have been completely and utterly wasted. Couldn't we have got to this point 2, 3, 4 years ago?
Well, yes, but that would have required political will and political leadership. That I have always been an advocate of us using alternative dispute resolutions to find ways forward in Canterbury over some of these insurance issues. And what we're seeing here is the evidence that happens when that leadership is put in play.
Megan Woods talking to us earlier. Hopeful Christian, founder of the Gloriavale commune and convicted sex offender, has died of cancer at the age of 92. Hopeful Christian, formerly known as Neville Cooper, founded the community originally known as the Cooperites in 1969 in North Canterbury. They later moved to the West Coast in the early 1990s, now has about 600 members there at Gloriavale. One of his sons, Phil Cooper, left the commune at the age of 27. Phil returned to get some of his children, but others remained there with their mother. Our producer Bridget Burke has just spoken to Phil about the mixed emotions of learning of his father's death.
It's really hard because I don't think the emotions haven't really sunk in yet, and it's been a long time, and we knew it was going to happen one day. But I think the family hasn't had time to really digest the emotions of the reality of it. You know what I mean? Yet, and I think it's both numb, and I don't think there's not a lot, Bridget. I know how I feel, so yeah, the feelings are he's my dad, and he will always be my dad, and I will always respect him. And I think that's probably the saddest thing is that all I would want to do is just pay my respects to my dad, and as my dad as anyone would do. So so Bridget, not a lot more I can say. Is just that I wish and pray that the family could just be left and digest the circumstances around it, as it's still quite numb and raw to all of us, and we will in our own way hopefully one day be able to show our respects in some way. So there's not a lot more I can say, Bridget, but
I just wonder, how did you hear about the news?
Oh, look, I'm someone inside there. How it all gets out. Sooner get someone knows someone outside and that's inside, and and they would have contacted someone, and then that person contacted my sister and contacted us. So
the proverbial grapevine in action.
Yeah. Look, and I think that's how we as a family found out, and that was the only way we were ever going to find out. But look, I think in the end of the day, all we pray and hope is that through it there could be some healing, and who knows, Bridget, what the outcome. And everyone would probably like to speculate, but I'm not going to speculate of any outcomes or any results at this point in time.
It's been some years since you last saw your dad. Is there a feeling like you are welcome to go to visit him?
No. Look, there's no welcoming. And look, at the end of the day, that's a tragic part of it. Family would love to be there at the funeral, but obviously that will never happen. But so I've experienced my mum passing away and not being at her funeral. So so we know the heartache that causes, and look, we will deal, and we'll always carry that.
Phil Cooper talking to Bridget Burke. The new government, well, relatively new, wants to halve child poverty in 10 years, and the Prime Minister herself holds the child poverty reduction portfolio. Its families package is expected to make a dent in that, with 384,000 families with children expected to be better off by an average of $75 a week by the time it's fully rolled out by 2021. As part of RNZ's special pre-budget series, our social issues reporter Sarah Robson looks at whether there'll be more in Thursday's budget to ease the pressure on those most in need.
The Families Package is a $5.5 billion centrepiece of the new government's push to tackle child poverty. It includes boosting Working for Families, the $60 a week Best Start payment for families with newborns, and a winter energy payment for beneficiaries and superannuitants. It's already budgeted for and set to kick in on July the 1st. The Finance Minister, Grant Robertson, describes it as the most significant set of changes for low and middle income families for many decades. He says there is more the government needs to do alongside it to improve outcomes for children, but that's unlikely to involve specific measures in this Thursday's budget.
There are other initiatives in terms of housing where that's hugely relevant, making sure there's been announced by the government as a pre-budget announcement about dealing with homelessness, making sure we're building more state houses, passing the Healthy Homes Guarantee Act, which we did as part of the 100-day plan, that will actually mean that the houses that these children are growing up in are warm and dry, lifting the minimum wage. These are things that will have a big impact around some of the families that are suffering in terms of child poverty.
Treasury has projected the Families Package will lift 54,000 children out of poverty by 2021. But Susan St John from the Child Poverty Action Group says despite the very significant cost to the government, it doesn't do enough to help the very worst off children.
While the families package will certainly help, it's only a drop in the bucket compared to what these families actually need to be restored to some kind of adequacy.
Susan St John says there are a number of steps the government could take to address that.
The first thing that they could do is to stop all sanctions in the benefit system where there are children, and they should then make sure that the core benefits are raised significantly so that beneficiaries aren't spending their time arguing with WINS about top-ups.
The manager of the Salvation Army's social services, Pam Moore, agrees that the extra money in the families package is a good start. For a lot of families, it will immediately be swept up in repaying debt. She says high housing costs remain the biggest pressure on the budgets of families coming to them for help.
So you can get your rent paid, but can you do anything else? Can you keep your children fed? Can you pay your power bill? Can you get well-made clothing and blankets, things like that?
While the Prime Minister herself has taken on the portfolio of child poverty reduction, Pam Moore says the Salvation Army is seeing more and more single men in need.
Unemployment is a big factor for a lot of them. We've got people with mental health issues who are struggling. We've got people with addiction issues, and just they've become marginalised. They may be trying to look after family that's separated from them, so they'll have child support payments, which take quite a bit out of their benefit each week. And so costs keep rising, and so they're at the bottom of the heap.
There is also the growing problem of elder poverty. The Chief Executive of Age Concern Auckland, Kevin Lamb, says 7% of people over the age of 65 are living in poverty, about 50,000 people. He doesn't think there is enough awareness of the financial challenges faced by the elderly, and for many, their superannuation just isn't enough to live on.
One of the real sad realities is you have people who are making life choices they should never have to make. Do they seek medical care, go to the doctor? Do they heat their home? Do they buy food? And they might need to do all of those three things, but have to make a choice to not do one or two of them because they simply can't afford it.
Elsa Warburton turned 80 last month. Since her husband died last year, she's lived alone in her Housing New Zealand property in Three Kings in Auckland. The pension is her only income, so she's a careful budgeter and conscientious about saving power.
I turn the hot water on every second day. I don't use a stove, I use a microwave. I've got all energy-saving lights and, for natural heating, in the daytime, and as it starts to get cool, I shut the doors and it keeps the heat in the house.
Despite her attempts at budgeting, Elsa Warburton says there's not much money left over at the end of the week.
By the time your phone and your power and everything else is put aside, and the doctor's visits or the chemist or whatever it is, and the taxi fares because I can't drive, it actually comes out that you're not really on a winning streak.
An extra $50 a fortnight would make Elsa Warburton happy, and it would give her a bit of wriggle room to do something that she enjoys other than going to church. But any specific measures to target older people or those without children who are living in poverty look unlikely in this year's budget. The Social Development Minister, Carmel Sepuloni, says they will benefit from broader changes, such as the winter energy cash payment and increases to the accommodation supplement.
The thing is, they'll still be better off, and so there are things that are particularly targeted towards families, and then there are other things that will benefit a broad range of people, some families and obviously others that are single without children.
The government has already signalled it's likely to make an announcement soon about its promised overhaul of the welfare system. That will look at benefit sanctions, ensuring access to entitlements and a review of working for families. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Sarah Robson, aho.
We're going to return to Jerusalem now and the opening of the US embassy there with the deaths of at least 55 Palestinians protesting against it. We wanted an American perspective on this to try and understand Washington's view outside the Trump presidency. And we went to Daniel Kurtz, a professor of Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Now, Mr. Kurtz has been US ambassador to Israel and Egypt, and he's written books about America's role in the Middle East. I spoke to him this afternoon.
Look, almost every president in the last 30 years has agreed that Israel's capital is in Jerusalem, but every president until Trump decided not to move our embassy in view of the fact that this would compromise the United States' ability to play a role in helping to mediate the Arab-Israeli conflict. So in that respect, there's no difference of view almost anywhere in the United States with regard to where Israel has located its capital. But since Israel and the Palestinians agreed back in 1994 that they would negotiate the status of Jerusalem, it makes no sense for the U.S. to have taken a unilateral decision to move the embassy, and for the President of the United States to then say that he's taken the issue of Jerusalem off the table. This effectively takes the United States out of the peace process.
Yes, you used the word compromise before, but it is more than that, isn't it? The United States is gone as a player now, isn't it?
Well, the administration says it has a plan, but so far has been reluctant to put it forward. And ever since the president announced the Jerusalem decision in December, the Palestinians have said they don't want to see the plan. They don't believe the United States is an honest broker, and they're likely to reject anything out of hand. So right now, it appears that the administration has no strategy whatsoever with regard to the Middle East peace process.
Where does this leave the Palestinians in terms of their ability to litigate any kind of grievance and work towards a meaningful and lasting settlement with Israel over the disputed territory that is Jerusalem?
You know, taking a broader view, the Palestinians share probably a disproportionate amount of the responsibility for the failure of the peace process. Successive Israeli leaders, starting with Rabin and then Barak, Ehud Olmert, have all put forward, reasonable starting positions, and the Palestinians have never reciprocated. So, they've had a chance to both air their grievances through diplomacy and also to advance the peace process. That said, they're in a very difficult bind right now because the United States has clearly sided with Israel on this important issue of Jerusalem. We've seen over the past few months that the Saudis and some others in the Arab world are losing patience with the Palestinians, and much of the rest of the world is frankly fatigued by this conflict that just doesn't go away.
Daniel Kurtz is speaking to us earlier. That is Checkpoint for tonight.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. A Christchurch homeowner who's been fighting the government-owned insurer Southern Response says the long legal battle has been mind-numbing. The Child Poverty Action Group says the government's families package doesn't go far enough to help the poorest children. Bloody clashes between Palestinians and Israeli soldiers are expected to continue overnight.